If you still think your biggest enemy is laziness, you haven't been paying attention. The real danger is more humiliating than that. It's the version of you that keeps negotiating with impulses you already know are destroying your future. To the new viewers beginning to notice patterns most people spend their lives avoiding, welcome. And to the returning viewers already building a quieter form of discipline through awareness, restraint, and psychological control, welcome back. Turn on subtitles for this one. Not because the words are complicated. Because some truths only land when you see them and hear them at the same time. There's a battle happening inside you right now that almost nobody talks about correctly. Not a battle between good and evil. Not discipline versus motivation. Not success versus failure. Something far more personal. Your future self is trying to build a life your current urges are actively trying to destroy. And the disturbing part is this. The urges usually sound more convincing. They sound reasonable at midnight. They sound harmless after stress. They sound deserved after effort. One drink, one scroll, one message, one excuse, one delay, one more night wasting hours you'll never recover. Your future self speaks quietly. Your urges speak immediately, and most people mistake immediacy for truth. That's why they wake up 10 years later inside lives they accidentally created. You can see it everywhere once you notice it. The man who says he wants respect but cannot control his attention for more than 30 seconds. The woman who says she wants peace but feeds herself stimulation every waking hour until silence feels threatening. The person who says they want change while protecting every habit responsible for their suffering. People don't usually lose their future in one catastrophic decision. They lose it in private negotiations nobody else hears. That's the part society avoids discussing because it forces responsibility back into the individual. And responsibility is heavy. Especially when you realize your life is not being shaped by your goals. It's being shaped by what you repeatedly fail to resist. You felt this before. That strange moment after an impulse finally gets what it wanted. The food arrives. The notification appears. The video ends. The pleasure hits. And then something colder slips in immediately after it. Not guilt. Recognition. A quiet awareness that you betrayed a version of yourself again. Most people numb that feeling instantly. They reach for another distraction before the discomfort fully forms into language. Another scroll, another laugh, another stimulation, anything to prevent confrontation with the truth. Because if they stayed still long enough, they would realize something terrifying. Their urges are not random. They are trained. Every time you obey an impulse against your own long-term interest, you strengthen a psychological pathway that becomes harder to resist next time. You teach your nervous system that immediate comfort outranks future meaning. And eventually your mind stops asking permission. It assumes surrender. That's when a habit becomes identity. Not when you repeat an action. When your brain begins expecting weakness from you. Watch human behavior carefully and you'll see this everywhere. People speak confidently about ambition while living completely under the control of appetite. They talk about freedom while being emotionally manipulated by notifications, cravings, loneliness, attention, validation, pornography, alcohol, gossip, comfort, entertainment, or fear. Modern society calls this normal because normalization is profitable. A distracted person consumes more. An undisciplined person obeys more. A person disconnected from themselves becomes easier to influence. That's why silence feels uncomfortable now. Stillness exposes things stimulation was hiding. You've probably experienced it yourself. You decide to improve your life. You feel clear for one night. Maybe after a painful experience. Maybe after humiliation. Maybe after looking at yourself honestly for the first time in months. You tell yourself things will change now. And for a few hours, you believe it. Then the next day comes. Your phone lights up. Stress returns. Comfort becomes available again. And suddenly the clarity disappears as if it never existed. But it did exist. The problem is that your future self was trying to speak from a place your urges could not survive in. Stillness, honesty, awareness. Most people never stay there long enough to hear themselves clearly. Because modern life is designed to interrupt self-confrontation. Constant stimulation protects people from their own unresolved reality. That's why some individuals panic in silence. Not because silence is empty. Because silence removes anesthesia. And underneath the noise, many people discover something they've spent years avoiding. They do not trust themselves anymore. They cannot rely on their own word. Think about how dangerous that becomes psychologically. Every promise you break to yourself weakens internal authority. You say you'll wake up earlier. You don't. You say you'll stop wasting time. You don't. You say you'll control the urge this time. You fail again. At first it feels small. But repetition changes meaning. Eventually your mind starts treating your own promises like background noise. You stop believing yourself. And once self-trust collapses, discipline becomes nearly impossible because there's no internal credibility left behind your decisions. This is why many people feel mentally exhausted before they even begin changing their lives. They are carrying years of unresolved self-betrayal. The strange part is most people never frame it this way. They think they lack motivation. No, they lack evidence that they can trust themselves under pressure. There's a difference. Motivation is emotional. Self-trust is psychological infrastructure. One disappears with mood, the other survives discomfort. That's why disciplined individuals often appear calmer than everyone else. Not because they enjoy suffering. Because they removed negotiation. The average person spends enormous mental energy arguing with impulses all day. Should I do it? Should I stop? Maybe tomorrow. Maybe one more time. Maybe I deserve it. Disciplined people simplify the process. The decision was already made earlier. That creates psychological freedom most people never experience. But reaching that point requires something painful first. You must stop romanticizing your urges. That includes the ones society encourages. Especially those. Because not every destructive behavior looks dramatic. Some look socially acceptable. Endless scrolling, constant consumption, chronic distraction, seeking validation through attention, living entirely through mood. These behaviors seem harmless individually. But together they create a fragmented mind incapable of sustained depth. And depth matters more than people realize. A shallow mind cannot build a meaningful life because it cannot stay with reality long enough to understand it. That's why many people keep restarting their lives every Monday. They chase emotional intensity instead of psychological consistency. One emotional video, one burst of motivation, one temporary identity shift, then collapse. Again. Because inspiration without structure becomes another addiction. This is also why your future self often feels emotionally distant. You keep meeting him briefly during moments of clarity, then abandoning him during moments of craving. Imagine doing that to another human being repeatedly. Promising loyalty, disappearing, returning emotionally, leaving again. Eventually trust dies. Your relationship with your future self works the same way. Most people never build a future worth living because they keep emotionally abandoning the person they could become. And the worst part, the consequences arrive slowly enough to ignore. That's what makes urges so dangerous. If every destructive impulse caused immediate visible destruction, people would change quickly. But life usually charges interest quietly. Years quietly disappear, potential quietly erodes, attention quietly weakens, confidence quietly collapses. Then one day the accumulated damage becomes visible all at once. That moment terrifies people, not because life became hard suddenly. Because they realize the signs were there the entire time. You can hear it in certain conversations if you listen carefully. People saying things like, "I don't know where the time went. I used to have ambition. I thought I'd be further by now." Those sentences sound innocent, but hidden inside them is grief. Not grief over failure. Grief over abandoned potential. And abandoned potential creates a very specific kind of pain because deep down, people usually know when they participated in their own decline. That knowledge follows them quietly. Sometimes for decades. You see it in exhausted eyes. In forced humor. In overstimulation. In constant busyness. In people who cannot sit alone without reaching for something to consume. Because unresolved self-awareness creates psychological friction. And most people spend their lives trying to reduce friction instead of confronting its source. But there's something else happening underneath all this that almost nobody explains properly. Your urges are adaptive. They evolve around your weaknesses. That's why the same solutions stop working after a while. You delete the app, the mind finds another escape. You remove one distraction, another appears. Because the problem was never only external. The deeper issue is your relationship with discomfort itself. Most impulses are escape routes. not pleasures. Escape routes from boredom, from loneliness, from uncertainty, from self-doubt, from emotional tension, from confronting reality directly. That's why people often return to destructive habits during emotionally vulnerable periods. The urge is not asking for pleasure. It's asking for relief. And relief can become addictive faster than pleasure itself. This is where the internal war becomes visible. Your future self is trying to teach you endurance. Your urges are trying to protect you from discomfort. One builds capacity. The other builds dependency. One expands your life slowly. The other shrinks it quietly. And here's where the trap becomes dangerous. Your urges genuinely believe they are helping you. That late-night distraction, temporary emotional regulation, that impulsive purchase, artificial control, that constant entertainment, avoidance of internal tension. The mind prioritizes immediate emotional survival over long-term transformation unless consciously trained otherwise. Which means if you never develop awareness, your future gets sacrificed to protect your present comfort. That sentence alone explains millions of ruined lives. If this is already exposing patterns you've been privately fighting, press like on the video. Not for the algorithm, as a personal acknowledgement that you're done pretending your impulses are harmless. And in the comments, write, "I owe my future self-discipline." Because the people willing to say that publicly are usually the same people beginning to understand something deeper than motivation. Discipline is not punishment, it is protection. Protection of your future from your temporary emotional states. Most people understand this too late. They spend years obeying moods without realizing moods are unstable narrators. A mood can convince you to destroy progress you spent months building. A craving can erase clarity that took years to develop. One emotional decision can introduce consequences that outlive the emotion itself. That's why emotionally reactive people often feel trapped in repetitive cycles. They build based on inspiration and destroy based on feeling. There is no stability there. Only oscillation. And oscillation slowly destroys identity. You become unpredictable to yourself. 1 week focused, next week impulsive, 1 month disciplined, next month collapsing again. This inconsistency damages something deeper than productivity. It damages self-respect. Because self-respect is built partly through observed self-control. Your mind watches what you tolerate from yourself. It notices when you repeatedly abandon standards. It notices when you lie to yourself. It notices when you betray your own intentions for comfort. And eventually the internal voice changes tone. Not loudly, quietly, from possibility to disappointment. Most people hear that voice eventually. Usually late at night. Usually after another wasted day. Usually when distractions stop working for a few minutes and reality slips through the cracks. That moment matters more than people realize. Because beneath the disappointment is still awareness. And awareness means the battle is not over yet. But what happens next determines almost everything. Most people respond by seeking more stimulation. More noise. More escape. More excuses. A smaller group does something different. They become willing to sit inside discomfort long enough to understand what their urges have been protecting them from. And that changes everything. Because once you stop treating impulses like commands, you start seeing them for what they really are. Signals, not authority. That realization sounds simple, until your entire nervous system resists it. The first time you truly resist an urge, it doesn't feel empowering. It feels unnatural, almost wrong. Your body becomes restless. Your mind becomes louder. Suddenly every justification sounds intelligent. Every excuse sounds compassionate. Every delay sounds reasonable. That's when most people misunderstand what's happening. They think discomfort means they're failing. In reality, discomfort often means the old version of you is losing influence. And the mind hates losing familiar patterns, even destructive ones. Especially destructive ones that kept you emotionally sedated. Because your nervous system values familiarity more than excellence. This is why people return to toxic relationships they know are damaging. Why they reopen apps they swore they deleted permanently. Why they sabotage progress immediately after momentum begins building. The known pain feels psychologically safer than unfamiliar responsibility. People say they want change. What they usually want is improvement without identity disruption. But real transformation always threatens the personality built around comfort. That's the hidden cost nobody talks about. Your current identity is emotionally attached to the habits destroying you. Not because you enjoy suffering, Because repetition creates psychological attachment. Even destructive routines become emotionally familiar homes. That's why some people panic when their life finally starts improving. The chaos they complained about was also the environment their nervous system understood. Stillness feels foreign. Discipline feels rigid. Structure feels uncomfortable. Peace even feels suspicious. You can observe this in subtle behavior. Someone finally gets time to focus deeply on their goals, and suddenly they feel an urge to check notifications every 3 minutes. Not because the phone matters. Because uninterrupted focus forces confrontation with the self. Depth removes distractions, and distractions were protecting them from awareness. This is why modern people struggle to remain alone with their own thoughts. Silence begins exposing unresolved internal conflict, the unfinished ambitions, the neglected responsibilities, the uncomfortable truths, the version of themselves they could have become. Most people would rather consume noise than encounter that version honestly. That's why overstimulation has become an emotional coping mechanism disguised as entertainment. And the dangerous part is that it looks normal now. A person can spend 10 hours consuming content, reacting emotionally to strangers online, escaping into stimulation, and society barely considers it concerning anymore. But observe what it does psychologically over time. Attention weakens, patience disappears, reflection becomes difficult, emotional impulsiveness increases, the mind loses tolerance for delayed gratification, and eventually the person cannot distinguish between what they genuinely want and what they've been conditioned to crave. That distinction matters more than almost anything. Because your future self is built through intentional choices. Your urges are built through conditioned reactions. One creates direction, the other creates dependency, and dependency quietly destroys human potential. You can feel it in the way many people move through life now. Constant urgency, constant distraction, constant emotional fluctuation. Their minds never fully settle because they trained themselves to require stimulation to feel normal. Then they wonder why meaningful work feels impossible. Meaningful work requires sustained attention. Sustained attention requires internal stability. Internal stability requires discipline over impulse. Everything connects. That's what people fail to understand. Your inability to control small urges eventually affects massive areas of your life. The person who cannot control their attention usually cannot control their emotions either. The person constantly escaping discomfort rarely develops resilience. The person addicted to immediacy struggles to build anything requiring patience. And almost every meaningful thing in life requires patience. Strength, mastery, trust, respect, financial freedom, emotional control, a powerful mind. None of these are built quickly. But urges demand immediacy. That's why your future self and your impulses are fundamentally incompatible. One worships construction, the other worships relief. And relief becomes dangerous when it becomes your highest priority. Because if avoiding discomfort becomes your main operating principle, your life slowly organizes itself around weakness. You start making decisions based on emotional ease instead of long-term alignment. You avoid difficult conversations, avoid difficult work, avoid uncertainty, avoid discipline, avoid accountability, avoid growth itself. And at first, nothing dramatic happens. That's what deceives people. The consequences arrive quietly. Your standards lower gradually. Your attention fragments slowly. Your confidence erodes subtly. Your future shrinks invisibly. Then years pass, and one day reality becomes impossible to negotiate with anymore. That's when people suddenly feel stuck. But they were never suddenly trapped. They were gradually conditioned into limitation through repeated obedience to comfort. There's a reason disciplined individuals often seem emotionally different from everyone else. They stopped treating every feeling as an instruction. Most people are emotionally obedient. A feeling appears and immediately controls behavior. I don't feel like it. I'm stressed. I'm tired. I'll start tomorrow. Notice how often emotions become unquestioned authority. But emotions are temporary states, not strategic advisors. If your entire life is directed by emotional weather, stability becomes impossible. This doesn't mean becoming emotionless. It means refusing to surrender your future to temporary internal conditions. There's a difference. A calm, disciplined mind still feels urges, still feels temptation, still feels exhaustion. The difference is behavioral authority remains intact. The urge speaks. The individual decides. Most people reverse that relationship. That's why they feel powerless. Because powerlessness begins psychologically long before it becomes external. Every time you repeatedly act against your own long-term interest, your mind absorbs a message. You are not in control. Eventually that message becomes identity. And identity is powerful because people unconsciously behave in alignment with who they believe they are. Someone who internally identifies as weak will unconsciously seek evidence confirming weakness. Someone who identifies as impulsive expects collapse eventually. Someone who identifies as undisciplined subconsciously anticipates failure before effort even begins. This is why changing behavior without changing self-perception rarely lasts. The internal identity eventually pulls behavior back toward familiarity. That's why temporary motivation fails so often. People try to force new habits onto an unchanged identity structure. It creates internal resistance. Real transformation happens differently. You stop asking, "How do I resist this urge?" and start asking, "Who becomes stronger every time I refuse it?" That question shifts the entire psychological framework. Now the moment of temptation becomes meaningful instead of annoying. Now discomfort becomes evidence of rewiring. Now resistance becomes identity construction. That changes everything. Because suddenly the battle is no longer about deprivation. It becomes about alignment. Your future self is no longer some abstract fantasy living years away. He becomes present in every decision, every refusal, every moment you choose long-term clarity over immediate relief. That's the part most people never experience. They think discipline is constant suffering. No, undisciplined living creates far greater suffering. The difference is delayed. One pain arrives immediately and leaves quickly. The other arrives slowly and stays for years. Look carefully at people consumed by impulse and you'll notice something beneath the surface behavior. Exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion alone. Psychological exhaustion. Because living reactively drains enormous energy. Constantly recovering from emotional decisions. Constantly restarting goals. Constantly repairing consequences. Constantly negotiating with yourself. That cycle destroys internal peace. And peace matters more than excitement. Most people chase stimulation because they mistake intensity for meaning. But intensity fades quickly. Peace lasts. A disciplined mind experiences a type of calm impulsive people rarely understand. Not because life becomes easy. Because internal conflict decreases. When your actions consistently align with your deeper values, friction inside the mind reduces. You stop carrying the hidden shame of self-betrayal everywhere you go. That hidden shame affects more behavior than people realize. It changes posture, speech patterns, confidence, eye contact, presence. People sense when someone has stopped respecting themselves internally, even if they cannot explain why. That's why discipline changes more than productivity. It changes energy. Because integrity generates a quiet form of psychological strength impossible to fake long term. You can see it in certain individuals immediately. They move slower, speak more carefully, react less emotionally. Not because they lack emotion. Because they are no longer controlled by every internal fluctuation. There's stability there, and stability becomes rare in overstimulated societies. Most people now exist in a constant state of low-level psychological agitation. Their minds never fully rest. Notifications, entertainment, comparison, consumption, noise. The nervous system remains overstimulated so consistently that stillness starts feeling uncomfortable. Then they mistake overstimulation for aliveness. But there's a huge difference between stimulation and vitality. Stimulation excites the nervous system temporarily. Vitality strengthens the individual deeply. One leaves you drained afterward. The other leaves you clearer. That's why many pleasures feel strangely empty after repetition. Because the nervous system adapts quickly while the deeper self remains underdeveloped. The urge keeps demanding more while satisfaction decreases. That pattern exists everywhere. More scrolling, more entertainment, more consumption, more validation, yet less fulfillment. Because urges cannot produce meaning. They can only produce temporary interruption. And interruption is not the same thing as peace. A lot of people are not truly relaxed anymore. They are distracted. There's a difference. Distraction suppresses awareness temporarily. Peace remains even when stimulation disappears. That distinction becomes visible the moment someone sits alone without external input. Can they remain present? Can they think clearly? Can they tolerate silence? Can they face themselves honestly? Most cannot. Not because they're incapable, because they trained themselves away from stillness for years. And stillness matters because clarity lives there. Your future self does not emerge through constant noise. He emerges through observation, through reflection, through deliberate action repeated consistently enough to reshape identity. But there's something uncomfortable about that process. Nobody can do it for you. Not a motivational video, not a mentor, not a book, not philosophy itself. At some point, reality becomes brutally personal. You either continue surrendering your future to urges, or you stop. No one else experiences the consequences on your behalf. No one else wakes up inside the body your habits created. No one else inherits the mind your behaviors trained. No one else carries the regret of abandoned potential. That responsibility scares people, which is why many stay distracted forever. Distraction delays accountability, but delayed accountability compounds consequences. That's why avoidance always becomes expensive eventually. And some costs cannot be refunded. Lost years, destroyed focus, damaged self-trust, a weakened mind. Those things take enormous effort to rebuild once neglected long enough. Still, most people continue underestimating small decisions. They think transformation comes from dramatic moments. Usually it doesn't. Your life changes through repeated ordinary choices nobody else sees. Getting up when you said you would. Closing the app instead of opening another video. Sitting with discomfort instead of escaping immediately. Finishing difficult work without emotional theatrics. Remaining calm during emotional pressure. Keeping promises to yourself quietly. These moments seem insignificant individually. Together they rebuild identity. And identity eventually shapes destiny. This is why disciplined people often appear almost invisible during the construction phase of their lives. Nothing dramatic seems to be happening externally. But internally, an entirely different person is forming. A person becoming harder to manipulate, harder to distract, harder to emotionally destabilize. That threatens systems built around impulsive consumption. Because disciplined individuals regain something modern society quietly weakens. Attention ownership. Once you fully control your attention again, your life changes rapidly. Because attention directs behavior. Behavior shapes identity. Identity shapes reality, which means every urge is competing for control over the architecture of your future. That's why seemingly small habits matter so much. They are not isolated behaviors. They are votes for the type of mind you are building. Every impulse obeyed reinforces one identity. Every impulse resisted reinforces another. And eventually one side becomes dominant. This is where many people become uncomfortable. Because deep down, they already know which side they've been feeding. They know how many promises they abandoned. How many hours disappeared. How many opportunities dissolved through distraction. How many times they chose temporary comfort over long-term respect. And once awareness reaches that level, excuses stop feeling convincing. That's why some people avoid content like this entirely. Not because it's wrong. Because recognition creates responsibility. The moment you see the pattern clearly, continuing the behavior becomes psychologically heavier. You can no longer pretend ignorance. That tension matters. Sit with it. Don't rush to escape it immediately. Because the instinct to instantly relieve discomfort is the exact mechanism keeping many people trapped. Most individuals have never fully observed an urge without obeying it. Think about that carefully. The feeling appears, and almost immediately behavior follows. No observation, no pause, no separation, just reaction. But the moment you create even a few seconds of awareness between impulse and action, something profound begins happening psychologically. You realize the urge is not you. It is an event occurring inside you. Temporary, fluctuating, often irrational. That separation changes the entire battle. Because once the observer inside you becomes stronger than the impulse itself, the dynamic shifts permanently. Now you are no longer drowning inside every craving. You are watching it, studying it, understanding it, and understanding weakens emotional slavery. If this video is helping you recognize patterns most people spend years running from, subscribe and become part of a mindset built on awareness instead of impulse, discipline instead of emotional obedience, clarity instead of distraction. Share this with someone silently fighting themselves right now. Most people look normal externally while losing internal wars nobody else can see. Because the truth is, the battle between your future self and your urges was never just about habits. It was about ownership. ownership of attention, ownership of behavior, ownership of identity, ownership of your life itself. And the moment you begin reclaiming that ownership, your entire relationship with yourself starts changing in ways you cannot fully understand yet. But first, something painful has to happen. You must stop lying to yourself about what your impulses are costing you. Most people never calculate the real price of their urges. They only measure the immediate consequence. The wasted hour, the money spent, the broken routine, the lost sleep. But those are surface-level costs. The deeper damage happens invisibly. Every time you repeatedly choose comfort over alignment, you alter the relationship between your mind and your own authority. That damage accumulates quietly, and eventually you start feeling it in places you don't immediately connect back to your habits. You hesitate more, you doubt yourself faster, you avoid difficult opportunities, you become emotionally fragile under pressure. You struggle to focus deeply. You feel disconnected from your own potential. Not because you were born weak. Because repeated self-betrayal trains psychological instability. That's the part many people resist hearing. They want transformation without accountability. They want confidence without discipline. Peace without restraint. Respect without standards. But the mind does not work that way. Your brain is constantly recording evidence about who you are through behavior. Not intention. Behavior. That distinction changes everything. Because most people judge themselves by their intentions while reality judges them by repeated action. You intended to improve. You intended to change. You intended to become disciplined. But your nervous system only trusts what you repeatedly demonstrate. This is why people can feel trapped even while genuinely wanting better lives. Desire alone does not rebuild identity. Repeated evidence does. And evidence requires consistency during moments when emotion disagrees. That's where the real separation happens. Not when life feels easy. Anyone can speak confidently when motivated. Anyone can make promises during emotional clarity. The real battle begins when discomfort arrives and your mind starts offering escape routes. That's when character becomes visible. Not publicly, privately. Inside ordinary moments nobody else witnesses. That late hour when you know you should stop. That difficult morning when your body wants comfort instead of effort. That emotional moment when distraction feels easier than self-control. Your future is often decided in those invisible moments. Not in grand dramatic scenes. In quiet decisions repeated daily. This is why seemingly successful people sometimes still feel internally weak. External achievement can hide unresolved self-conflict for years. A person can build money while destroying their attention. Build status while losing discipline. Build appearance while losing inner stability. And eventually internal collapse starts leaking outward. Because no amount of external success can permanently silence internal disorder. You can see this clearly in people addicted to validation. No achievement satisfies them for long. No attention feels sufficient. No praise creates lasting peace. Because urges always escalate. That's their nature. An undisciplined appetite never says, enough. It expands. That's why people who constantly obey impulses often feel strangely empty despite endless stimulation. The mind adapts to pleasure rapidly while becoming weaker under dependency. And weakness creates anxiety. Think about what dependency actually means psychologically. It means your emotional state becomes controlled by external conditions. You need the distraction, need the approval, need the stimulation, need the escape. Without it, discomfort surfaces immediately. That is not freedom. That is emotional captivity disguised as modern living. Real freedom feels different. Real freedom is being able to sit inside discomfort without immediately collapsing into reaction. Being able to feel boredom without panic. Loneliness without self-destruction. Stress without compulsive escape. Silence without needing constant interruption. That kind of stability is rare now. Because most people unknowingly trained themselves to fear internal stillness. Stillness exposes the truth too clearly. And truth demands decisions. Once you clearly recognize what a behavior is costing your future, continuing it requires deeper self-deception. That's why awareness can feel painful initially. You begin noticing things you previously normalized. How often you reach for stimulation automatically. How quickly your focus fractures. How emotionally reactive certain triggers make you. How easily temporary feelings influence major decisions. How much of your behavior is unconscious repetition rather than conscious choice. At first, this realization can feel discouraging. But it's actually the beginning of power. Because unconscious patterns only control you fully when they remain unseen. The moment awareness enters the process, change becomes possible. Not easy. Possible. There's an important distinction there. People often romanticize transformation as some dramatic emotional breakthrough. Usually it's much quieter, much less cinematic. Real transformation often looks like repeated restraint without applause. You close the app. You stay focused. You remain calm. You keep your word. You sit with discomfort instead of escaping. You repeat this long enough that your nervous system slowly stops expecting surrender from you. That's when self-respect begins returning. Not through affirmations. Through evidence. And evidence changes internal dialogue naturally. You stop needing to convince yourself you're disciplined. Your actions already proved it repeatedly. This is why deeply disciplined people often appear less emotionally chaotic. They built internal certainty through behavior. Not fantasy. Not performance. Not temporary inspiration. Behavior. That creates psychological grounding. And grounded individuals become difficult to manipulate because emotional impulses stop controlling their decisions so easily. Notice how many systems profit from impulsiveness. Fast entertainment. Fast outrage. Fast pleasure. Fast consumption. Everything designed to keep attention fragmented and emotional regulation externalized. A distracted population is easier to influence because fragmented attention weakens independent thought. That's why reclaiming control over your mind becomes almost rebellious now. Not loudly rebellious. Quietly. You stop reacting automatically. Stop consuming constantly. Stop surrendering every emotional state to external stimulation. And suddenly you begin seeing society differently. You notice how normalized dysfunction became. People unable to maintain focus. Unable to tolerate silence. Unable to regulate emotion without distraction. Unable to exist without constant digital input. And because it became common, people mistake it for harmless. But common behaviors still produce devastating outcomes. Look at the emotional condition of many people now. Anxiety everywhere. Restlessness everywhere. Mental exhaustion everywhere. Attention collapse everywhere. Yet almost nobody wants to question the lifestyle patterns creating it. Because questioning them would require sacrifice. And sacrifice threatens comfort. That's the hidden reason many people avoid discipline. Not because discipline is impossible. Because they fear what life looks like without their escapes. That fear runs deeper than people admit. Who am I without the distractions? Without the validation? Without the coping mechanisms? Without the endless stimulation? Many people genuinely don't know anymore. Their habits became fused with identity. That fusion creates resistance when change begins. Because now giving up the behavior feels like losing part of yourself. This is why transformation often feels emotionally disorienting before it feels empowering. You are dismantling parts of an identity your nervous system grew attached to. Even if that identity was limiting you. And during this stage, something strange happens. The old pleasures start feeling emptier. Not fully satisfying anymore. You begin noticing the artificiality. The compulsiveness. The predictability. The emotional residue afterward. At the same time, discipline still feels difficult because the new identity hasn't fully stabilized yet. So you exist temporarily between two versions of yourself. One familiar but weakening. The other stronger but still developing. That in-between stage is where many people quit. Because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. The old life no longer satisfies them fully. But the new life has not become natural yet. This phase matters enormously. Because this is where emotional maturity begins separating itself from emotional dependency. An emotionally dependent person obeys internal states automatically. An emotionally mature person can experience discomfort without surrendering direction. That ability changes everything in life. Relationships, work, health, money, peace of mind, decision-making. Because life constantly tests emotional stability. Stress arrives. Temptation arrives. Loneliness arrives. Failure arrives. Rejection arrives. And in those moments, your habits reveal the truth about your inner structure. Not your words. Not your image. Your habits. That's why disciplined people trust structure more than emotion. Emotion fluctuates constantly. Structure protects direction during fluctuation. Most people only follow standards when emotionally convenient. That's not discipline. That's preference. Real discipline continues after emotion withdraws support. And strangely enough, That consistency creates a deeper form of confidence than motivational thinking ever can. Because now confidence is no longer dependent on mood. It's rooted in evidence. You survived urges before. You endured discomfort before. You remained aligned before. So your mind stops panicking every time difficulty appears. This is what resilience actually feels like internally. Not emotional numbness. Stability under pressure. A lot of people think strong individuals simply feel less temptation. Usually false. They simply stopped romanticizing it. They no longer treat every craving like an emergency requiring satisfaction. They understand something most people ignore. An urge can feel powerful without being important. That distinction frees you psychologically. Because now intensity stops controlling meaning. You can feel discomfort without assigning authority to it. You can feel temptation without obeying it. You can feel emotion without becoming emotionally directed. That separation creates space for conscious living. And conscious living changes the quality of existence entirely. You stop drifting through automatic behavior patterns. You start choosing deliberately, speaking deliberately, consuming deliberately, reacting deliberately, protecting your attention deliberately. Attention becomes extremely valuable once you realize it shapes identity itself. What repeatedly captures your attention eventually influences your thoughts. Your thoughts influence your behavior. Your behavior influences your future. Which means protecting attention is not productivity advice. It's psychological survival. Most people underestimate how dangerous constant distraction becomes over years. A fragmented mind struggles to build coherent meaning. It struggles to sustain depth. And depth is where wisdom develops. Not inside endless stimulation. That's why some of the clearest individuals often live differently from the culture surrounding them. They guard their attention carefully. Not out of superiority, out of understanding. They know the mind adapts to whatever repeatedly enters it. Chaos enters repeatedly. The mind becomes chaotic. Shallow stimulation enters repeatedly. Depth weakens. Emotional outrage enters repeatedly. Inner peace collapses. Everything you consume trains something. That includes what you normalize, what you excuse, what you repeatedly allow into your nervous system. This realization can become uncomfortable quickly because it removes the illusion that your environment is neutral. It isn't. Every environment shapes behavior subtly. Every repeated exposure influences perception. Every habit reinforces identity. That's why transformation eventually requires environmental honesty too. You cannot constantly surround yourself with distraction while expecting deep clarity. You cannot normalize impulsiveness while expecting internal stability. You cannot repeatedly feed weakness while hoping strength magically appears. At some point reality demands congruence. And congruence is powerful because it reduces internal contradiction. Your actions align with your values. Your habits align with your standards. Your environment aligns with your future. That alignment creates peace many people search for in all the wrong places. Not perfect peace, stable peace, the kind built through self-respect. And self-respect changes how you experience the world. You become less desperate for approval, less emotionally reactive, less vulnerable to manipulation, because you are no longer constantly abandoning yourself internally. That internal loyalty matters more than people realize. Most emotional instability begins when individuals repeatedly disconnect from their own deeper values to satisfy temporary states. The more often this happens, the weaker identity becomes. And weak identity creates confusion. Confused people are easily influenced, easily distracted, easily controlled. That's why rebuilding discipline is not just self-improvement. It is reclaiming sovereignty over your own mind. Quietly, deliberately, without performance. Without needing applause, just a person slowly becoming stronger than the impulses that once controlled them. And eventually something surprising begins happening. The urges lose some of their authority. Not because they disappear completely. Because you stopped worshiping them. You stopped treating temporary feelings like absolute truth. You stopped assuming discomfort meant danger. You stopped collapsing every time resistance appeared. That changes the entire internal atmosphere of your life. Now your future self no longer feels distant. He starts appearing in present behavior. In your restraint, in your focus, in your standards, in your ability to remain aligned even when emotion shifts. And once that process begins deeply enough, you realize something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Your urges were never the real enemy. Your unconscious obedience to them was. That realization changes the entire structure of the battle. Because once you stop seeing yourself as helpless against your impulses, responsibility becomes unavoidable. Not motivational responsibility, real responsibility. The kind that quietly follows you into ordinary moments where nobody is watching. That's where your future is actually being shaped. Not in public declarations. Not in temporary bursts of inspiration. In repetition. People underestimate repetition because it looks small while it's happening. But repetition is how identity gets written into the nervous system. A person does not suddenly become disciplined. They become someone who stopped surrendering in small moments consistently enough that the brain began expecting restraint instead of collapse. That expectation matters, because eventually your mind adapts to the standards you repeatedly enforce. This is why your life starts changing long before external results appear. Internally, a different psychological environment begins forming. Less chaos, less negotiation, less emotional volatility, more clarity, more steadiness, more trust in yourself. And trust in yourself changes everything. Because once self-trust returns, action becomes lighter. You stop wasting energy convincing yourself to do what already aligns with your identity. The average person has exhausted themselves through constant internal contradiction. Wanting one thing, practicing another, valuing growth, feeding distraction, claiming discipline, protecting comfort. That split creates friction constantly. And friction drains life force. You can see it in people who always look mentally tired despite doing very little meaningful work. Their energy is being consumed internally. By guilt, by avoidance, by unresolved tension between who they are becoming and who they continue choosing to be. Most people don't need more motivation. They need fewer contradictions. That's why disciplined living often feels calmer than impulsive living. Not easier, cleaner. Your mind stops fighting itself constantly. And once that internal war quiets down, something unexpected emerges. Attention. Real attention. The kind modern life has nearly destroyed. You notice details again, patterns again. Your thoughts slow down enough to become coherent. You can focus without immediately reaching for stimulation every few minutes. And when attention strengthens, life changes rapidly because awareness deepens. You start seeing consequences earlier. You recognize emotional traps faster. You notice manipulation more clearly. You understand people more accurately. Most individuals are not observing reality carefully anymore. They are reacting to it emotionally in real time. That's why emotional control has become such a rare form of power. A reactive person is predictable, easy to influence, easy to provoke, easy to distract, but a person who can pause before reacting becomes difficult to control psychologically. That pause matters enormously. Inside that pause lives freedom. Not external freedom, internal freedom. The ability to choose your response instead of being dragged by impulse automatically. That single ability separates powerful minds from fragile ones. And it's built through repeated resistance to unconscious behavior. This is why discipline affects far more than productivity. It changes perception itself. A disciplined mind sees reality more clearly because emotional impulses stop distorting every decision. Most suffering is intensified by emotional reactivity. People panic too quickly, speak too quickly, consume too quickly, escape too quickly, attach too quickly, collapse too quickly. They live entirely at the mercy of emotional weather patterns. Then wonder why peace feels impossible. Peace cannot exist where impulse holds authority over behavior. There's always another craving, another distraction, another emotional fluctuation demanding attention. That's exhaustion disguised as modern living. Real peace feels different. It comes from knowing your mind no longer controls you through every temporary urge. It comes from being able to trust your own direction even during discomfort. That trust creates psychological stability impossible to purchase externally. And external things cannot replace internal stability for long. Not money, not status, not attention, not pleasure. You've probably noticed this already. Some people have endless stimulation available to them and still feel deeply restless. Because stimulation does not solve internal fragmentation. It only interrupts awareness temporarily. The deeper problem remains waiting underneath the noise. That's why so many people fear silence. Silence removes distraction. And without distraction, reality speaks. You hear the neglected goals, the wasted time, the emotional dependence, the unresolved fear. The version of yourself you keep postponing. Most people run from those realizations immediately. They open another app, start another conversation, find another escape, anything to avoid staying still long enough for truth to fully land. But the individuals who eventually transform do something rare. They remain there, inside the discomfort, inside the awareness, inside the confrontation with themselves, long enough for honesty to become stronger than avoidance. That's the turning point, not when life suddenly becomes easy. When denial stops feeling comfortable. After that, your relationship with urges changes permanently. You stop seeing them as harmless pleasures. You begin recognizing them as crossroads. Tiny decisions with long-term psychological consequences. Every impulse obeyed strengthens one future. Every impulse resisted strengthens another. And eventually those futures become radically different lives. One version of you becomes mentally scattered, emotionally dependent, reactive, distracted, easily manipulated, constantly seeking relief. The other becomes grounded, clear, emotionally stable, difficult to influence, capable of depth, capable of restraint, capable of building something meaningful over time. Both futures are being constructed right now, quietly, through ordinary behavior. That's the terrifying part, and also the empowering part. Because it means your life is not decided by talent alone, or luck alone, or intelligence alone. It is deeply influenced by what you repeatedly tolerate from yourself. Your standards become your future in slow motion. That's why disciplined people often appear almost invisible during the process. There's no dramatic performance, no constant announcement, just repeated alignment, repeated restraint, repeated construction. Most people overlook this because modern culture glorifies visible intensity more than invisible consistency. But invisible consistency changes lives permanently. Intensity fades quickly. Consistency rewires identity. And identity determines behavior automatically over time. That's why eventually discipline stops feeling like force. It becomes preference. Your nervous system begins preferring clarity over chaos, depth over distraction, peace over overstimulation. You no longer need to constantly resist every urge aggressively because your relationship with yourself changed fundamentally. The old behaviors stop matching your identity. That's real transformation, not white-knuckling your way through life forever. Becoming someone who genuinely values alignment more than temporary escape. And that shift creates a kind of freedom many people never experience. The freedom of not constantly fighting hidden shame. The freedom of keeping your own word. The freedom of emotional stability. The freedom of attention ownership. The freedom of not being psychologically dependent on endless external stimulation to function. People underestimate how powerful that becomes. A person who controls themselves becomes difficult to control externally. That's one reason disciplined individuals often intimidate others quietly. Not through aggression, through presence. There's something unsettling about a person who cannot be manipulated easily through emotion, validation, fear, or impulse. Because most modern interaction unconsciously relies on emotional reactivity. But when someone develops inner steadiness, those mechanisms stop working as effectively. That steadiness also changes relationships. You stop chasing people emotionally. Stop needing constant reassurance. Stop tolerating environments that weaken your mind. Stop abandoning yourself for approval. Because self-respect quietly raises standards everywhere. And standards shape destiny more than motivation ever will. People rise or fall toward what they repeatedly accept as normal. If distraction becomes normal, depth disappears. If weakness becomes normal, discipline weakens. If emotional chaos becomes normal, peace becomes foreign. Your environment matters. Your habits matter. Your attention matters. Everything repeated matters. That realization can feel heavy initially because it removes comforting illusions. But it also returns power. You stop viewing yourself as a victim of impulses and start understanding the role awareness plays in freedom. Awareness interrupts automatic behavior, and interruption creates choice. That's where transformation lives, not inside perfection. Inside conscious choice repeated consistently enough to alter identity. Some days you will still struggle. Some urges will still feel intense. Some moments will still test you unexpectedly. But intensity is no longer the point. Authority is. Who decides your behavior when discomfort appears? Your impulses, or your deeper values? That question quietly shapes entire lives. And every day you answer it whether consciously or unconsciously. Most people spend years feeding impulses while hoping for disciplined outcomes. But outcomes follow structure. Always. A fragmented life eventually produces fragmentation. A disciplined life eventually produces stability. Not instantly. Eventually. That word matters because modern minds hate delayed results. People want immediate evidence, immediate transformation, immediate certainty. But deep change often happens invisibly first. Roots before results. Internal order before external success. That phase requires patience many people never develop because impatience itself became normalized. Yet nature itself operates through gradual construction. Muscle, wisdom, trust, mastery. Everything meaningful deepens slowly. Your future self is built the same way. Quietly. Through repetition. Through standards. Through moments where nobody would have known if you surrendered, except you. And those moments matter more than most people realize. Because your mind is always watching. Always recording. Always learning what to expect from you. If you repeatedly collapse under pressure, the mind learns weakness. If you repeatedly remain aligned under discomfort, the mind learns resilience. Eventually resilience becomes automatic. That's when life starts feeling different internally. Less frantic, less scattered, less emotionally exhausting. You begin carrying yourself differently because you know something privately. You can trust yourself now. That feeling is priceless. Because once self-trust returns deeply enough, many destructive behaviors lose their emotional grip naturally. You no longer need them to escape yourself. And that may be the deepest transformation of all. Not becoming perfect. Becoming someone who no longer needs constant escape from their own mind. Most people never realize how much of their behavior is actually avoidance until they stop distracting themselves long enough to see clearly. But once you see clearly, there's no going back completely. You begin recognizing the pattern everywhere. In society, in relationships, in yourself. The endless pursuit of relief. The fear of stillness. The addiction to immediacy. The emotional obedience disguised as freedom. And slowly, quietly, you begin stepping outside of it. Not because you became superior. Because you finally understood the cost. So the next time an urge appears, pause before reacting. Not dramatically. Quietly. Observe it. Feel it. And remember something most people forget in the exact moment they need it most. An urge is temporary. But the person you become by repeatedly obeying it, is not. If you reached this point, subscribe and continue strengthening a sovereign mindset built on awareness, discipline, emotional control, and clarity in a distracted world. Like the video if you're done negotiating with impulses that weaken your future. And in the comments, write, "My future deserves better." Because that sentence is not motivation. It's a decision. Now continue to the next video. Do not break the chain you started here tonight. Because somewhere beneath your distractions, beneath your impulses, beneath every excuse you've repeated to yourself for years, the future version of you is still waiting to see whether you finally become someone he can trust.